Oh, you haven't voted yet? Well, you can always vote next year in the election. Unless your vote is being suppressed. Voter suppression? We don't do that anymore in the United States. Well, unfortunately, Daniel, we still do, and it's one of the biggest problems our country is currently facing. Perfect segue as always. When I watch the news, I feel like I keep seeing the same two polar opposite arguments when it comes to voter suppression.
Republicans in Georgia continue to work to suppress the vote and shape the electorate to their liking to ensure that they decide who's elected in that state.
There is no widespread voter suppression in this country, and everybody knows it.
So, which is it? Does voter suppression even exist? Well, me. To answer your question, yes, voter suppression does continue to persist in our country, but there are some ways to stop it, and I'll explain that later. To give some context over the fight over voter suppression today, it's important to understand how we even got here in the first place. Remember learning about the civil rights movement in school? Where, like, MLK led the movement and eventually got Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Okay, cool. You paid attention in history class, but what also came out of the movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed a lot of the discriminatory practices designed to prevent black people from voting, and it also registered just a ton of new voters. Pretty cool when the government helps people out, right? Yes, but actually, one part in particular of the VRA is where a lot of fights over voter suppression takes place. Now, this is the disclaimer, okay? I am not a lawyer, and yet I'm going to try to explain one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases in American history, so obviously I am not the most qualified person to talk about this, but I did my own research, so you could trust me, and I'll link my paper in the description if you even want to read it. So, okay, here we go. So, in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case that involved the Voting Rights Act, which I talked about, that was passed in 1965. And the case is called Shelby County v. Holder, and it revolves around Section 5 of the VRA. Now, Section 5 essentially used a formula to pick certain states and, like, local municipalities, so, like, towns and counties and stuff like that, that had a, quote, history of discrimination. Now, these places had to get their voting laws pre-cleared by the Justice Department, meaning that if they essentially tried to pass a law that changed the procedure for how people vote, the Justice Department, so like the federal government, the people who, federal lawyers and stuff, they had to approve it before it went into effect. Make sense? Now, what the Supreme Court said was that since the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, went into effect in 1965, they basically justified their decision, which I'll mention in a second, with the concept that our country has made, quote, great strides. They said that the pre-clearance formula, which I talked about earlier, essentially just wasn't needed, and they threw the entire thing in the trash. Basically, as soon as that decision came out in 2013, states began to pass a bunch of voter ID laws that put a bunch of new restrictions on voting, and they didn't have to be previously checked by the feds first. So basically, long story short, as a result of this decision that kind of gutted the VRA, there is way less federal oversight on state voting laws than there used to be. That's basically all you need to know. The feds just can't do as much as they used to check state voting laws. Now, of course, the people that pass these laws, state legislators and whatnot, they often talk about election integrity. But in reality, they just kind of end up discriminating against marginalized groups. Justification for these discriminatory laws is based on the notion that voter ID laws in themselves are not actually discriminatory because every American should have an ID, right? Wrong. 11% of Americans actually don't even have a photo ID, and that rate is higher among minorities, so there's that. For example, Texas, one of the states that had to deal with the pre-clearance thing before the Shelby decision, they passed a voter ID law literally minutes after the decision because it was a trigger law, and it tightened restrictions on types of ID that was allowed when voting. The state of Texas did research on this, and they found that among Latinos in the state, it's Texas, all right? It's a huge voting bloc. Latinos in Texas were 120% more likely to not possess a usable ID. 120%. And they still passed the law anyway. It's also worth noting that between 1995 and 2014, PBS did an investigation. They found that there were 171 successful lawsuits that basically argued in favor of racial discrimination. They argued that discrimination took place when voting. 82 of them were against Texas. 82. Yet, Texas continued to try to change their voting laws. So much so that the Department of Justice, before the Shelby decision, denied their, basically used their pre-clearance power to deny them from changing their voting laws 22 times. They tried to change their voting laws 22 times and were denied in the span of 19 years. Hey, Chief, great strides? This ain't it, buddy. Great strides? I got one response for you, bro.
Are you sure about that?
What do we even do about this? I mean, this is such a pervasive problem. It goes on in so many states. How do we actually fix voter suppression? How do we curb it? Well, there's actually a lot of legislation that we can pass. One thing we could do is give a free photo ID to every U.S. citizen. This is not something that we need the federal government to do. We can just have states do this themselves because they run their own elections. So they can just pass state laws that give everyone an ID in their state. At the federal level, we could also just bring back the pre-clearance formula under Section 5, but instead apply it to all 50 states. Basically, I found that an interesting note about Chief Justice John Roberts, he wrote the majority opinion in the Shelby case. It's not that he doesn't want new federal voting rights legislation. He's fine with it. He doesn't say that the federal government can't do that. It's just, it has to be based on current data. And I'm no lawyer or lawmaker, okay? I'm just some schmuck in a dorm room nerding out over like obscure legalese from 10 years ago. But if I haven't proven to you by now using data that voter suppression is still a problem, then I don't know what to say, okay? We can reinstate Section 5, but instead of applying it to like a handful of states, just apply it to every state, because it would make it much more difficult to pass these discriminatory laws. Dude, we get some IDs to every American voter, provide some more federal oversight, and dude, our democracy is about to be looking like that Shaq and Kobe meme. Just like, oh, what's that voter suppression? Boom! Slam dunk. You just got posterized voter suppression. Alright, here are 3 main takeaways, alright, about voter suppression. Number 1, voter suppression remains an issue in America, but it can be solved, alright? Number 2, states can make specific policy reforms to increase turnout, not decrease it. And number 3, the federal government must be given more oversight power to protect against these discriminatory laws. So if you can remember those 3 things, then I think you got the gist of what I was trying to say. So thanks for watching. See you later.